Souls Across Time. A Story of Past Lives and Present Hearts. By Goldie. Episode 1. When Nicki Met Kenji. Nicole had a name that her mother gave her with ceremony, but the people who loved her called her Nicki, and that was the version that fit. She grew up in the green, unhurried hills of rural Jamaica, in a place where the mornings came in slowly, where the smell of rain on red dirt roads was a kind of language, and where the quiet between things was never emptiness, but always something waiting to be heard. She learned early to sit with herself. She learned to notice what most people moved past too quickly to catch. Her grandmother, a small and precise woman who chose her words the way other people choose their clothes, had told her once, plainly and without mysticism, that Nicki was an old soul. Thus she had been here before. She said it the way you state a fact about geography, and Nicki stored it in the part of herself where she kept things she did not fully understand, but believed anyway. She came to UMass Boston on her own terms. First in her family to cross an ocean for a degree, she packed 2 suitcases and a stubbornness that her mother called determination and her sister called pride. And she arrived in a city that was gray and fast and full of people who never made eye contact on the subway. She had worked 3 jobs the summer before she left Jamaica, saved every dollar with the focused discipline of someone who could not afford to let a single one escape. Her mother had held her in the airport departure hall for a long time without saying anything, and when she finally let go, she cupped Nicki's face in both hands and said simply, "Go and come back bigger." Nicki had carried that instruction across the Atlantic and into every early morning and late night that Boston required of her. She walked into every room like she already belonged there, even when she wasn't entirely sure she did. She loved affection the way some people love music, completely and without apology. The warmth of a hug. The anchoring weight of a hand holding hers. These were not small things to her. They were the language she was most fluent in, the one she returned to when words fell short. She had always kept herself whole and unhurried, had never been in a rush to give herself to anything less than something real, and she had never felt ashamed of that clarity about herself. Kenji came from Tokyo. He had grown up in a city that never slept, and he had always been slightly apart from its motion, not separate from it, but not quite inside it either, the way a musician can hear the whole room while playing in it. His father played jazz in the small clubs in Shinjuku, and his mother had a piano in the front room and gave lessons 3 afternoons a week. He had grown up in a house full of sound and learned early that the most important things were said in silence. There was a precision to him that people sometimes mistook for coldness, but it was not coldness. It was attention. He noticed everything. He simply did not announce it. He had a habit, one he had never been able to explain satisfactorily, of arriving somewhere new and feeling like he was remembering it rather than seeing it for the first time. Not déjà vu exactly, something steadier than that, more like the feeling of a word that has lived in your head so long that when you finally encounter it in print, it looks exactly as you always imagined it would. Boston was the strongest version of that feeling he had ever had. The city was loud and unfamiliar and should have been disorienting, and instead it felt, inexplicably, like coming home to a place he had never lived. He did not know what to do with that, so he put it aside and enrolled in his classes and went on with things. He was good at setting things aside. He had an internal architecture built for it, precise shelves for everything he could not yet explain, ordered and patient, waiting for the right context to arrive. They sat 6 seats apart in the same seminar for 3 weeks before the world gave them reason to speak. Not because either of them was invisible, Nicki had noticed the quiet man who always had a book open before the professor arrived, and Kenji had noticed the woman who laughed at something in her notes and then looked up briefly, as though checking whether anyone else had caught the joke. But noticing is not the same as meeting, and parallel lines, however close, have their own rules. Except they had been touching the edges of each other's lives for longer than either of them knew. There was a coffee shop in Dorchester, a small corner place with mismatched chairs and jazz on the speakers and a barista who remembered your order by the second visit. Kenji had been there on a Tuesday afternoon in September, deep in a book, and had looked up at the sound of laughter from across the room. A woman with her head thrown back, laughing at something the barista had said, entirely unself-conscious about it. He had the brief, strange feeling that he recognized her from somewhere he could not locate. He looked back down at his book. When he looked up again, she was gone. There was a bookstore in Cambridge on a rainy Saturday in October, the kind of narrow shop that smells of old paper and dust and the particular contentment of people who prefer books to most other things. Both of them had drifted, separately and without knowing it, into the same aisle of world literature. Nicki had pulled a book from the shelf and turned it over in her hands, reading the back. She did not buy it that day. She went back for it 2 weeks later and found it was the last copy. She had no way of knowing that someone else had held the same spine and considered it and put it back 20 minutes before she arrived. There was a ramen bar in Alston that stayed open past midnight and never seemed to run out of broth. They had each been there on the same late Thursday, seated at opposite ends of the long wooden counter, each alone with their bowl and their silence. Neither had looked up. 3 near misses. 3 times the world arranged them in the same room and waited, and the timing was just slightly wrong, a few minutes, a second glance that came too late, a book put back instead of bought. It would have taken almost nothing. It took a class project instead. They were paired on a Wednesday afternoon in October, assigned to each other by a professor who made the decision alphabetically and thought nothing more of it. The library study room had glass walls and a long table and afternoon light that came in at an angle. Nicki arrived first, spreading her notes with the efficient quiet of someone who had learned to take up space without apology. Kenji arrived 2 minutes later, set down his bag with a nod, and they got to work. The conversation moved without friction. That was the first thing she noticed, not the content of what they said, but the quality of how it moved, the absence of effort, the way ideas passed between them without the usual performance of getting to know you. They discovered their interests overlapped in ways that felt almost engineered. The same writers, the same documentary rabbit holes, the same habit of watching things at 2 in the morning when they should have been sleeping. Kenji mentioned a documentary about migratory patterns offhand, a passing reference, and Nicki looked up from her notes and said she had watched it 3 times. They fell into the conversation and forgot the project entirely for almost an hour. The afternoon kept going. The library emptied around them. Through the glass walls of the study room, they could see the building shifting from the busy hum of mid-afternoon into the quieter, more focused energy of evening, students moving more slowly now, settling in for the long hours. Neither of them noticed. They were deep in a conversation that had somehow covered 3 continents, 2 languages, and the precise question of whether the feeling of homesickness is fundamentally the same as the feeling of anticipation, which Nicki argued it was and Kenji said he needed to think about. He thought about it for 30 seconds and said she was right. She said she usually was. He smiled, a real one, unhurried and complete, and she looked at it and looked away. Then Nicki mentioned the coffee shop in Dorchester. She described the jazz on the speakers and the barista who never wrote anything down, and something shifted behind Kenji's eyes, a small, precise movement, like something clicking into place. He leaned forward and said quietly that he knew that place. He had been there in September. On a Tuesday. She had been there on Tuesdays. They looked at each other across the table and began, carefully, to compare notes, the bookstore, the ramen bar, all of those parallel Tuesdays and Saturdays and midnights, and the accumulation of it settled between them like weather. Strange and close and impossible to dismiss. Neither of them reached for their laptops. At some point they both reached for the same pen. Their hands met briefly, unhurriedly, an accidental and then deliberate touch. Nicki did not pull away. Neither did he. It lasted only a second and rearranged something permanent. She walked home across campus as evening came in, the air carrying the first real edge of autumn, that particular cold beneath the warmth that reminds you the season is changing whether you are ready or not. She had felt connection before. She had had conversations that surprised her, friendships that deepened faster than she expected. But this was not that. This had none of the familiar architecture of a new connection. This felt like something she had been in the middle of for a long time without realizing it. She had read once, in a book her grandmother had given her, that the soul recognizes what the mind cannot yet explain. She had thought it was a beautiful idea. Walking across the dark campus with the autumn air moving around her, she pressed her palm flat against her chest and felt her own heartbeat, steady and certain, the way it always was, except that now it seemed to be saying something she had not heard it say before. Ren's jealousy begins. Ren had been Kenji's closest friend since the first week of the semester, the kind of friendship that doesn't announce itself, but simply appears. Built on borrowed lecture notes and convenience store runs at midnight and the unspoken relief of finding someone familiar in an unfamiliar city. He had grown up in Osaka, not Tokyo, a distinction he rarely mentioned because people rarely asked. There was a precision to the way he moved through the world that read as composure to strangers and as something more complicated to the people who actually knew him. He was not a man who performed his feelings. He was a man who placed them very carefully somewhere load-bearing and then wondered, at intervals, why the whole structure felt slightly off. He had come to Boston on a merit scholarship that demanded excellence and received it, delivered without ceremony. He was very good at the work. He was also very good at the particular discipline of wanting something and saying nothing about it, a quality that had served him well for most of his life, until the moment it stopped serving him and became something else entirely. He had noticed Nicki for the first time early in the second semester. She had walked into the campus cafeteria with her head down over a book, found a table near the window without looking up, and read for 2 hours without moving. Something about her stillness struck him the way a tuning fork strikes, a vibration that moved through him and settled somewhere he could not name. He did not introduce himself. He never did with things that actually mattered to him. He told himself there would be time. He filed her away with the careful attention he gave to everything important and returned to his own work. He did not return. Time moved the way it does when you are not watching it, and the semester turned, and she remained at a distance he had chosen without fully examining why. What he was not prepared for was the afternoon Kenji began talking about her. They were at their usual table in the campus cafe, the one by the window with the wobbling leg that neither of them had ever thought to report. Kenji was not a man who talked around things, and he did not talk around this. He described her directly, a woman from class, her laugh, the way she held an argument, the strange and accumulating coincidence of all those places they had both been. He was not performing the story. He was reporting it, the way you report something that has happened to the universe, and therefore to you. There was a softness in his voice that Ren had heard precisely once before, years ago in a different city, and recognized immediately as the real thing. Ren listened. He was good at listening. He held the silence around Kenji's words with the practiced ease of someone who had made a discipline of not reacting, and he heard his best friend describe, in careful and genuine detail, a woman Ren had loved in silence without ever finding the moment to say so. The injustice of it was enormous and wordless. It sat in his chest like a stone placed there very gently by someone who did not know what they were doing. He said the right things at the right intervals. He asked a question or two. He was, to all appearances, a good and attentive friend. He had been one for long enough that the performance of it had long ago become indistinguishable from the real thing, which was, he supposed, how friendship worked. And also how the performance of not wanting something eventually becomes something you can almost believe yourself. Inside, something cold settled and did not move. He saw them together once, from across the quad, on a Thursday afternoon when the light was low and golden. Nicki had turned toward Kenji and touched his arm briefly, pointing at something across the courtyard, a small, unconscious gesture, the kind of touch that means a person has stopped thinking about whether or not they are touching you. Kenji had looked down at her. Rin saw the look from 30 yards away and understood it completely and turned away before either of them could glance up and find him standing there. He walked back the way he had come. He did not need to run through it again in his head. He had catalogued it with the same precision he applied to everything, and it was already filed. What Rin felt was not a simple thing, and he did not pretend to himself that it was. It was love that had never been spoken, and had therefore never been released, love that had stayed inside him past its time, turning slowly into something that still had love's shape but not its nature. He did not hate Kenji. That would have required a pettiness he did not have access to. But he could not watch this happen with his hands in his pockets, and so his mind, which was always precise, always strategic, which had never in his life failed to locate an angle, began to move in a new direction. He thought of Janice. He had met her twice when she came to visit her sister, and both times she had registered in his mind as a variable worth keeping. There was an energy to her that he recognized, the particular restlessness of someone who is very good at measuring a room and has never quite made peace with what the measurements mean. She smiled with her whole face. Her eyes calculated. When she had looked at Kenji the second time she visited, she had looked the way a collector looks at something rare, not with love, not with warmth, but with the cool recognition of something she had assessed and decided she wanted. Ren understood that look. He was fluent in it. He could not have told you exactly what he imagined they might build together. He knew only that their interests were adjacent in a way that had potential. That was enough to begin with. He pulled up her number in the dark of his room late that night, the phone screen the only light. He wrote the message twice, deleted it once, and sent the third version. Then he set the phone face down on the desk and looked at the ceiling and listened to the silence settle back around him, the particular silence that follows a door clicking shut on something you are not yet ready to name. Janice. Janice had spent most of her life being the first thing people noticed when she walked into a room, and she had never fully decided whether this was a gift or a requirement. It was simply the condition of her existence. She arrived, and the room adjusted. She was beautiful and magnetic and certain in the way of people who have never had reason to doubt their own centrality, and in a family of 2 daughters, certainty had always been her particular territory. Nicole was the other kind. Quiet where Janice was loud. Still where Janice moved. Their mother loved them both with the complete and impartial love that some mothers manage, the kind that does not play favorites and does not pretend to, and Janice had experienced this, from the time she was old enough to notice, as a kind of structural unfairness. Not that she was loved less. She was not, and she knew it. But to be loved equally with someone quieter was to have the ground shift beneath a certainty she had always taken as fixed. She loved Nicole. That part was real and had always been real, coexisting without contradiction alongside the other thing, the need to be the one who arrived first, who was seen first, who held the better version of whatever the room was offering. She had never examined this about herself carefully. People rarely examine the things they have always believed to be simply how they are. She had grown up the one people noticed. Nicole had been the one their mother said saw more than she let on. Their mother had not meant it as a comparison, but most things that are not meant as comparison still function as them, and Janice had grown up with a fluency in comparison that she would have been the last to admit. She flew in from Miami in October, where she had been managing events at a hotel on South Beach, all logistics and performance and charm, which suited her perfectly. She came in like weather, full of energy, filling Nicole's small dorm room with her perfume and her opinions and the particular warmth she reserved for her sister. That warmth was genuine. It had always been genuine, even when it contained its opposite, the way warm fronts always carry the memory of cold. She had missed Nicole. That was true without qualification. And she had come, in some layer of herself she did not fully examine, to see what Nicole had now that she had not had before. Because there was something different this time, something in the way her sister moved through the room, in the ease of her, the settled quality that had not been there on the last visit. Nicole laughed more readily. She spoke about her courses with enthusiasm rather than obligation. There was a charge to her that Janice could feel but could not yet locate the source of. Janice noticed. She always noticed. Then came the knock at the door. He filled the door frame without trying to, not with size, but with a quality of presence, the particular composure of someone who takes up exactly as much space as they need and no more. He had dark eyes that were paying attention and a smile that did not perform itself, and when Nicole said his name in the introduction, his name was simply a fact about a person who was already clearly more than a name. He said it was good to meet her. He smiled again, the real kind, the kind that involves the whole face without announcing itself. Then Nicole grabbed her bag, and they were gone, the door closing behind them with the quiet ease of two people whose departure is already natural, already coordinated, already a thing that happens without negotiation. Janice stood in the middle of the empty room for a moment. She looked at the closed door. She looked at the space on the desk where Nicole's bag had been. Then she turned and began to unpack her overnight bag, methodically, folding things she did not need to fold. She told herself she was glad for her sister. She told herself this with the full conviction she brought to everything she decided, and she believed it, partially, in the way you can believe something that is also not the complete picture. She had not decided anything yet. She was simply aware. Simply awake to a set of facts she had assembled in the span of a brief introduction, filed with a thoroughness that would have surprised Nicole, had Nicole been there to see it. She left on Sunday morning. The sky over Boston was low and gray. At her gate in the airport, she sat with her carry-on between her feet and her phone in her hand without looking at it. She was turning something over, not a plan, not yet, barely even an intention. More like the early stage of a calculation she had not yet decided to complete. The flight was called. She stood, smoothed her jacket, and walked toward the gate. She stowed her bag, buckled her seatbelt, and watched Boston disappear beneath a layer of cloud. She told herself she was simply keeping an eye on things. She told herself she was a good sister. By the time the plane leveled off, she had already begun to compose, in the unhurried architecture of her mind, the shape of the next visit. She had not decided anything exactly. She never decided things in the moments people expected her to. She held them instead, the way you hold a hand of cards, privately and with patience, until the right moment to play. She had all the time she needed. She looked out the small oval window at nothing but white cloud and the long distance ahead of her, and she was already thinking, what parallel lines do when they finally cross? There is a version of the universe in which the coffee shop in Dorchester was the end of it, in which the man with the book looked up 1 second later and saw only a closing door, in which the near miss stayed a near miss and the story never began. That version exists somewhere, probably. It is not this one. Some people, the universe tries once. It arranges the room and adjusts the light and places two people close enough to feel the warmth of each other's presence, and if they do not turn toward each other in time, it moves on. There are too many other arrangements to make. But some people the universe is patient with. It circles back. It tries the bookstore. It tries the ramen bar after midnight. It sets them 6 seats apart in the same seminar and waits. It has all the time there is, and it is not sentimental about it. It simply keeps trying, with the quiet persistence of something that knows what it is doing. It does not announce itself when the moment finally comes. It simply lets a professor assign a project and a library room hold two people inside its glass walls on an October afternoon, and it watches. Nicki sat in her dorm room late that night with her textbook open and unread in front of her. The building around her had settled into its nighttime quiet, the particular hush of a place full of people all inside their own separate heads, and she sat inside it and thought about the way he had said her name. Not her full name, not yet, but the shape he gave it, complete and unhurried, the way you say a word you have been thinking about rather than a word you are simply using. She had heard her name thousands of times. She did not know it could sound like that. She pressed her hand flat on the desk and let the feeling be the size it actually was, which was large, and did not try to make it smaller. She had always known the difference between something small pretending to be large and something genuinely large that deserved the space it took up. This was the second kind. She let it be. Across campus, Kenji sat at his desk with work he was supposed to be finishing. He kept stopping. He would read a sentence and his mind would drift, and he would return and read it again and drift again. At some point, without deciding to, he had written her name in the margin of his notes, her full name, the formal one, which he had heard only once, in the moment of their introduction. He looked at it for a moment when he noticed it. He did not cross it out. He turned the page and tried to locate the thread of thought he had been following before, and could not, and found he was not particularly sorry about that. In his room, in the blue-lit dark of late night, Ren read the reply from Janice on his phone screen. Brief, precise, and already useful. He read it twice. Set the phone face down on the nightstand. Looked at the ceiling for a long time, at the ordinary white blankness of it. He weighed what he was doing in the careful and honest way he weighed most things, and he reached the same conclusion he had already reached. He did not stop. Some stories begin with a meeting. This one began long before that, in another city, another life, another room where two people reached for the same thing at the same moment and came just barely short of finding each other. It began in the coffee shop and the bookstore and the ramen bar and all the places they had shared without knowing it. It began, perhaps, before any of that, in some earlier arrangement that none of them had the language for yet. This was not the beginning. This was simply the first time, in this lifetime, that they were paying close enough attention to finally let it be what it already was.